Arghiri Emmanuel. If by socialism we mean what Marx used to call the higher stage of communist society, the question of the political superstructure that would be adequate to it is raised neither in theory nor in practice. In theory, because this society to everyone according to his needs is a classless society, hence unpolitical by definition. In practice, because not only does a society of this kind not yet exist in reality, but more importantly it's very problematic, and indeed even the merest glimpse of the concrete conditions of its advent, are absent from the programs of all revolutionary parties, whether in power or not. What has, however, constituted a crucial problem in the past, and still constitutes such a problem today, both in theory and in practice, is the political form which corresponds to the period of transition, in its two essential moments: the taking over of power by the proletariat on the one hand, and the substitution of cooperative production for the wage labor system on the other. Since the publication of the Communist Manifesto, controversies on this theme have been at the center of all schisms. The length and intensity of such disputes went together with a great ambiguity. The debates seem to have been polarized on two main issues. Can the proletariat come to power by peaceful means? And can it exercise power in a democratic way? Both are artificial problems. Artificial and real problems. For no political party is violence an end in itself, any more than nonviolence could be an autonomous categorical imperative. These are only means, and between these means and the corresponding ends there is no direct structural correlation. There can be an indirect one, to the extent that the radicalism of the goals determines the toughness of the resistance, but then the correlation is conjunctural, and does not pertain to the doctrine. Furthermore, the extent to which we may theoretically forecast this resistance and make practical preparations to break through it does not pertain to strategy, but to tactics. It cannot, therefore, be the basis for any a priori theoretical position on the need for violence. Even the most opportunist or the most conservative of parties would not hesitate to take up arms to defend itself against a violent attempt by its opponents to usurp a legally assumed power. On the other hand, the most genuinely revolutionary party would be only too happy to avoid civil war, if the circumstances were such that they could assume and hold power peacefully. Peacefully, however, does not mean legally, in the sense of a compliance with the rules of the game as established within the existing system, any more than violently necessarily means placing oneself outside the legal framework. To complete this confusion, democratic ways of assuming power are frequently assimilated to the idea of a gradual, evolutionary passage from one mode of production to the other, whilst, on the other hand, open violence is assimilated to a discontinuity of production relations, just as if reform was a synonym of nonviolence, and revolution of insurrection. Yet history is full of examples where mere rivalry between groups representing not social classes but only social strata have degenerated into conflicts more bloody and ravaging than others that have accompanied deep social transformations. A comparative analysis of the upheavals which followed the post-war decolonization in Africa would be telling in this respect. And if we go back to the revolutions that marked the passage from the feudal mode of production to capitalist relations, the lack of symmetry between the magnitude of social changes and the scale of the armed struggles that have punctuated them is still more obvious. The political compromise between the rising bourgeoisie and the great landowners in England formed the basis both for the establishment of a notably pure capitalist mode of production, and for a relatively peaceful passage from the old to the new order. By contrast, the historical necessity in which the French bourgeoisie found itself to rely on the small peasants in its struggle against the feudal lords made it possible to couple extremely bitter, bloody, and protracted struggles with an incomplete social transformation and hybrid production relations. 1. If the period between the assumption of political power by the proletariat and the latter's own disappearance were a true transition, such as was visualized by the founders and classics of Marxism, i.e. neither an autonomous mode of production, nor a political system organized for its own sake, but a complex of transformation processes, in other words, an aggregate of acts destroying the old social relations, there would be no break in continuity involved. This period should not be seen as having its own dialectic, but as forming an integral part of the general dialectics of the clash between capitalism and communism. It would represent not a stage in which we settle down, but a thoroughfare that has to be traversed. If these conditions were present, it would be idle to try to gauge the degree of repressively or autocracy of the system, analyze them in terms of democracy and dictatorship. As with the assumption of power, here too violence is a mere function of the toughness of opposition. The concept of dictatorship of the proletariat does not refer to form, but to content. It simply means that, after having seized the government, the proletariat assumes political power openly and directly. Thus, the relevant questions are of a different kind. Synthetically, they can be placed under three main headings. 1. Is it possible for the proletarian party to seize the bourgeois state apparatus, using for this purpose the latter's own institutions? 2. In the affirmative case, is it possible for the proletariat to transform society, while maintaining these same institutions? If not, what specific kind of state, particularly regarding means of repression, would be appropriate for this task? 3. When this task is completed, what can assure us that this specific state will wither away, somehow disappear of its own accord according to traditional Marxist theory? The legal road to power. To ask whether the proletariat can attack existing institutions from within amounts to asking whether it can come to power through general elections. It must first of all be recalled that, contrary to certain quite widespread ideas, universal franchise is far from constituting a natural instrument of the bourgeois order. What the bourgeois class brought with it was not universal suffrage, it was even its contrary, a property holders' franchise. To universal suffrage came later, under very particular historical conditions. 3. In France, paradoxically established or re-established, if the short interlude of the Second Republic is considered by Louis Bonaparte as an instrument of the empire of plebiscites, and in a prostitute form, it was not actually applied until after 1871. For in Germany, although introduced in 1866, it cannot be considered as having functioned normally until the emergency legislation against the socialists was repealed in 1890. And it was rather in the 20th century Italy, England, Belgium that general voting rights became a common characteristic of the developed capitalist countries, in fact, at a time when they could no longer serve the aims of a revolutionary class, since the working classes of these countries had meanwhile ceased to be revolutionary. 5. However, if we accept the anarchists at the beginning of the period and Lenin at the end, no revolutionary theoretician in this half-century from 1870 to 1919 which shaped the contours of modern socialist thought ever dared to suggest that the proletariat should a priori refuse to play the bourgeois parliamentary game, provided that certain conditions were fulfilled with regard to democratic liberties. Moreover, this game was seen not only uncontroversially as a springboard for agitation and mobilization, but also as an actual competition for conquering political power. The doctrine on this point could not, of course, have been elaborated by Marx himself, since in his lifetime general voting rights existed nowhere, or at least not long enough, or not in a political context propitious enough, for these voting rights to be seriously tested. In the abstract, however, Marx did not bar the possibility for the proletariat, in certain countries, to take hold of the state apparatus in a legal way. Already in the manifesto, the conquest of democracy was put down as a goal. The ambiguity of this last expression has sometimes been pointed to by those interested in challenging it. But not only was Laurent Lafargue's translation conquering public power by making use of democracy most probably supervised by Engels. In an article published in the October 7, 1847 Deutsche Brüsseler Zeitung, Engels wrote, "In all civilized countries, democracy has as its necessary consequence the political rule of the proletariat, and the political rule of the proletariat is the first condition for all communist measures." 6. Now, it so happens that not only did Marx and Engels take counsel together as to how to present the articles published in this Belgian newspaper against Karl Heinzen, but Marx consulted them again when writing the manifesto. Furthermore, In his introduction to the 1895 edition of the Class Struggles in France, Engels explicitly writes in reference to the quoted sentence: "The Communist Manifesto had already proclaimed the winning of universal suffrage, of democracy, as one of the first and most important tasks of the militant proletariat." 7. Here, Engels does not express a personal view, for which he could be considered as alone responsible, and which could be attributed to his alleged volte-face in the 1890s. He is referring to a historical document whose essence he knows perfectly. Short of intellectual fraud, his version must therefore be the correct one. And again, in the same text, he refers to the wording of the program of the French Workers' Party, written by Jules Guesde and Paul Lafargue under Marx's personal supervision, where it was plainly said that workers had converted voting rights from a means of deception as they had previously been into an instrument of emancipation. The importance that Marx attributed to general voting rights also appears indirectly in one of the passages of his 18th Brumaire dealing with the electoral law of May 31, 1850. Imposing the condition of a 3-year residence certified by the employer, this law had effectively abolished universal franchise. It was excluding the proletariat, wrote then Marx, from any share in political power. It barred the proletariat from the very arena of the struggle. It threw the workers back into the position they had occupied before the February Revolution. They were again outcasts. 8. In the class struggles in France, Marx is more explicit, but the most comprehensive contradiction in the Constitution consists in the fact that it gives political power to the classes whose social slavery it is intended to perpetuate: proletariat, peasants, and petty bourgeoisie. And it deprives the bourgeoisie, the class whose old social power it sanctions, of the political guarantee of this power. 9. But what perhaps best reflects and summarizes Marx's views on the matter is a note he wrote on September 24, 1878 for a Daily News article: "Our aim is the emancipation of the working class and the social overthrow that it implies. A historical development can only remain peaceful as long as it does not come across the violent opposition of the holders of the social power. Nevertheless, the peaceful movement could turn into violence, if those who are interested in the old order happen to rebel, if they are defeated by force. It will be as rebels against legal power." 10. Thus, violence, far from being an end in itself, is a sort of legitimate self-defense. In Marx's eyes, the Commune itself was such a case of lawful self-defense against the plot. Marx does not hesitate to call it coup d'état of March 18, 1871, when General Vinoy's troops attempted at 3 o'clock in the morning to seize the guns positioned on top of Montmartre, in spite of the fact that these were the private property of the National Guard. It was precisely in this context that Marx wrote, "He opened the Civil War." Marx's presentation of the matter was not casual. He reverts again and again to the legalist viewpoint when narrating the events of the Commune. Thus he strongly disputes the legitimacy of the Versailles National Assembly, which was elected under enemy pressure with a single purpose: to decide on the question of peace and determine its conditions. Once this purpose was fulfilled, its maintenance in office, says Marx, was a monstrous usurpation. It ought to be remembered, he adds, that the Commune in Paris was conceived in the autumn of 1870 as a measure of defense against the foreign invasion, and that on October 31 the self-imposed government of defense existed only on sufferance. 11. Starting from these scattered comments, there emerge the basic traits of the tactics of the proletariat within the framework of parliamentary bourgeois democracy, tactics that were deepened afterwards and crystallized by Engels in the famous watchword, "You shoot first, Messrs. Bourgeois." This meant playing the game of legitimacy to the end and taking the capitalist class in its own trap. The parties of order, as they call themselves, are perishing under the legal conditions created by themselves. And if we are not so crazy as to let ourselves be driven to street fighting in order to please them, then in the end there is nothing left for them to do but themselves break through this fatal legality. 12. It is notorious that Engels protested against a truncated reproduction of this text in Vorwärts, as well as against a presentation made by Liebknecht which he found tendentious. However, In its whole and beyond any philological dispute, this text is undoubtedly a systematic analysis of the possibilities for the proletariat to come to power by using bourgeois institutions. I do not suggest legality at any price, wrote Engels to Koskai and Lafargue. I am preaching these tactics only for the Germany of today. Even in Germany they may become inapplicable tomorrow. 13 The least we can say is that these protests are incomprehensible. For one thing, it is simply not true that Engels was referring exclusively to the German case. His text is clear: the Communist Manifesto had already proclaimed the winning of universal franchise. And Lassalle had again taken up this point. Our workers immediately took it in earnest. Has served as a model to the workers of all countries. Everywhere the German example of utilizing the suffrage, of winning all posts accessible to us has been imitated. In France, where the conditions for an insurrectionary coup de main are far more favorable than in Germany, even in France, the socialists are realizing more and more that no lasting victory is possible for them, unless they first win the great mass of the people. This is, however, not the point. For, it is self-evident that voting rights cannot be used where they do not exist. What does legality at any price mean? One cannot be legal at will. On the other hand, it is obvious that to remain with arms crossed when facing an act of violence against the results of a general election does not strengthen legality, it enfeebles it. One can hardly see how the cuts made by Vorwärts could have made Engels's text more legalistic than it was in its entirety. 14 Koskai and Lenin. On the other hand, Koskai is right when he says that this has nothing to do with the theory of class conciliation. You shoot first, Messrs. Bourgeois, does not mean that we shall not strike back. Literally, indeed, it means the opposite. One cannot help noticing that in Koskai's standpoint, as formulated in The Road to Power, there is not the least deviation from what was, up till then, the traditional Marxist view. The argument which had first been opposed to the latter, namely that the capitalist class will not surrender political power after an electoral defeat, was an unconvincing one. For if the final showdown on the streets is unavoidable, what more auspicious occasion could be imagined in which to make one's move than the day after an election victory, when the defeated capitalists, after having for so long glorified the absolute and unconditional cult of the numerical majority and the popular verdict, refuse all of a sudden to comply with it and shoot first? That is the most favorable situation to make the revolution, said Engels. 15 Koskai was in no way more naive than Marx or Engels about the possibility of a peaceful solution. Indeed, he made clear his wish for a violent confrontation. In The Road to Power, he invokes in this connection the following eloquent passage from Engels, and there is no doubt about it: they will shoot first. One fine morning, the German bourgeois and their government will get tired of watching with their arms crossed the rising tide of socialism. 16 Thus the question is not one of legality for the sake of legality, but of fighting on the legal terrain in order to oblige one's adversary to abandon it. Only one argument could relevantly be opposed to such a standpoint, namely, that as long as the bourgeoisie holds economic power it would be impossible to get a numerical majority, even if technically the elections were entirely fair and free. Indeed, even if the proletarian party itself headed the government organizing the elections, as was the case with the Constituent Assembly elections in the Soviet Union, in November 1917. This is exactly the argument that Lenin formulated, precisely and for the first time, after the negative results of those elections when, out of 36,260,000 votes, the Bolsheviks got only 9,020,000, or somewhat less than 25%. Koskai had asked the Bolsheviks, "Why do you not wait until you get the majority, before you expropriate the capitalists?" "Because," answered Lenin, "in essence, we shall never get the majority, if we do not expropriate the capitalists." This was something completely new, in relation to what had been inherited from the standard doctrine of the Second International, from that of the dominant faction of the First, or from the individual views of Marx and Engels. It can be said that it was new even for Lenin himself, who only a few months before these elections still remained faithful to the traditional line of "you shoot first, messieurs bourgeois." In order to achieve power, the class-conscious workers must win the majority to their side. As long as no violence is used against the people, there is no other road to power. We are not Blanquists, we do not stand for the seizure of power by a minority. And again, for the time being, as long as the capitalists and their government cannot and dare not use force against the masses, as long as the mass of soldiers and workers are freely expressing their will. At such a moment, any idea of civil war would be naive, senseless, preposterous. At such a moment there must be compliance with the will of the majority of the population. Should violence be resorted to, the responsibility will fall on the provisional government and its supporters. 17. Although this does not, of course, prejudge the substance of the case in favor of either viewpoint, it is nevertheless undeniable that it was Koski who, on this particular issue, stood on the side of orthodoxy and the traditional line, while it was Lenin who deviated to the left. Curiously, his text seems to echo Bakunin's characteristic analysis, made some 50 years earlier: the general franchise, as long as it is practiced in a society in which the people, the working masses, are economically subdued by a minority holding all property and capital, however independent or free it might be on the political plane, can only produce illusory and anti-democratic elections, absolutely contrary to the needs, wishes, and real aspirations of the population. Universal suffrage is the counter-revolution. 18. Lenin, for his part, writes, "The proletariat cannot achieve victory if it does not win a majority of the population to its side. But to limit that winning to polling a majority of votes in an election under the rule of the bourgeoisie, or to make it the condition for it, is crass stupidity, or else sheer deception of the workers. In order to win the majority of the population to its side, the proletariat must, in the first place, overthrow the bourgeoisie and seize state power. Secondly, it must introduce Soviet power. Thirdly, it must entirely destroy the influence of the bourgeoisie over the majority of the non-proletarian masses by satisfying their economic needs in a revolutionary way at the expense of the exploiters." 19. It is true that in his fifth thesis on the Constituent Assembly, Lenin referred also to a formal flaw in the elections of November 21, namely that the Socialist Revolutionary Party had taken part in them on the basis of united lists drawn up prior to its split. The implication seems to be that the distribution of seats between right-wing and left-wing SRS, as carried out by the deputies themselves, did not correspond to that which would have been made directly by the votes of the peasants. However, in the first place, even if we concede that with separate lists the left SRS would have collected a number of votes great enough for the Bolshevik/left SR coalition to secure the majority, this would not have altered the fact of the electoral defeat of the Party of the Socialist Revolution. For it is precisely upon the categorical refusal of the left SRS to acknowledge the socialist character of the revolution that this coalition broke up, the left SRS declining any participation in the government and even charging the Bolsheviks with anarchism, while the latter blamed the left SRS for stretching out a hand to the Avksentiefs, while offering the workers only their little finger. 22ndly, Lenin himself presents this fifth thesis only as a subsidiary reason, while the main reason was that, at the moment the elections were going on, the overwhelming majority of the people could not yet know the full scope and significance of the October Revolution. 21. This last sentence expresses the essence of the new Leninist doctrine: transform society first, win the majority afterwards. It also engendered another, subsidiary doctrine, which subordinated revolution, not to the majority of the people, but to the majority of the proletariat, and which constitutes the very limit beyond which dictatorship of the proletariat is transformed into dictatorship of the party over the proletariat. Koski's counter-argument, presented notably in Terrorism and Communism, is particularly weak. We are told, he writes, that a socialist majority is impossible even with the freest and most perfectly secret ballot, because capitalists control the press and buy off the workers. But that means considering the workers as a gang of base and illiterate cowards, It means proclaiming the failure of the proletarian cause. 22 Koskai is here playing with words somewhat. Nobody said that elections are falsified because capitalists directly buy workers' votes. The latter, in their great majority, follow their consciences in voting, like everybody else. But their consciousness is determined by their existence, according to the basic principles of historical materialism that Koskai well knows. The proletarian cause does not imply the existence of a proletariat that has already transcended the conditions of its own existence and consists exclusively of heroes and supermen. However, the weakness of Koskai's argument can neither confirm nor invalidate the Leninist thesis. What could substantiate it would be historical experience, for what it is worth. If we look at it, we must admit that up till now no workers' party with an openly revolutionary program in the sense of one calling for a change in the social relations of production has ever won in general elections in a capitalist country. Everything happens as if, for such a program, there were an absolute upper limit of about 25% of the electoral body. By contrast, this limit is easily transcended and an absolute majority itself can in certain cases be achieved by a left-wing party presenting a program of reforms within the capitalist mode of production. The French Popular Front in 1936, the contemporary French Union of the Left and the Italian Communist Party are cases in point. It can be said that Allende's Chile was a borderline case, in terms of three separate criteria. 1. The economic development of the country, which was quite significant, but fell short of that of great industrial countries. 2. The program of Unidad Popular, which was quite advanced, but remained within the limits of what a capitalist system could absorb without being annihilated. 3. The successive electoral results, which constantly approached, but still fell short of an absolute majority. The specificity of the workers' state. We have so far examined the legal road to power. The question we shall now turn to is whether the state apparatus of a bourgeois society, once seized and by whatever means, can be utilized by the proletariat, or whether it has to be replaced by another coercive apparatus, and if so, what kind. The two questions are quite distinct, even if the second depends to a certain extent on the solution of the first, even if, in other words, we admitted that the very fact of assuming state power by means of the state's own institutions renders, in some way, the proletariat prisoner of these, and therefore unable to destroy them and substitute something else for them. Thus the two questions may be interconnected, but they must not be confounded. It is precisely because they were confounded that a permanent ambiguity has pervaded Marxist debates, especially with respect to the concept of dictatorship of the proletariat. It is all the more necessary to dissociate them from each other in that the splits they have determined are not the same. We shall now find Koskai diverging from the accepted doctrine, while Lenin remains faithful to it. On the first question Lenin moved, as we have seen, from an insistence on the necessity to win over the majority to the idea of seizing power while still in a minority. On the second, he moved, paradoxical as it may seem, in the inverse direction. Having gone much further than anyone else in his analysis of the specificity of the future proletarian state, he ended up, after the revolution and after several disappointing attempts in the direction he had earlier advocated, by letting a state apparatus be established that was qualitatively of the same pattern as the representative and bureaucratic parliamentary republic generally used by the bourgeoisie, but minus bourgeois democracy. He even tried, repeatedly, to justify this retreat by explaining why the proletariat, once in office, could and should make use of this machinery for its own purposes, an idea that he had categorically dismissed before. The commune model. As early as 1852, Marx wrote in the 18th Brumaire that up till then all political upheavals perfected this machine instead of smashing it. He completed this elliptic formulation in his letter to Kugelmann 19 years later. If you look at the last chapter of my 18th Brumaire, you will find that I declare that the next attempt of the French Revolution will be no longer, as before, to transfer the bureaucratic military machine from one hand to another, but to smash it. 23 Lenin explains in The State and Revolution that Marx already knew in 1852 that this machine had to be destroyed, but did not know what should replace it. It was the commune that would give him the clue. However, this distinction is hardly more than verbal. For one cannot really know that a machine must be replaced without knowing in what way it is unsatisfactory, and if one knows that, one already has a contrario a certain idea of what one will have to substitute for it. At most we can say that in 1852 Marx had an intuition which was too vague to proceed on, and that the Commune provided him both with confirmation that the problem existed and with its solution. At any rate, it was only after and in relation to the Commune that Marx and Engels clearly formulated their famous thesis, first in the letter quoted above, then in the address to the International Workers' Association in June 1871, and finally in the preface to the new 1872 edition of the Communist Manifesto. The working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made machinery, and wield it for its own purposes. 24. What must it be replaced by? Nowhere in Marx's and Engels's works can we find, systematically expounded, a real theory of the proletarian state. Yet, by assembling their scattered ideas, we can establish a simplified schema as follows. In all class societies, a coercive machine ensures the existing order and preserves the social equilibrium. There is, however, a fundamental qualitative difference between the coercive systems used before the appearance of capitalism and that used in the bourgeois state. In the former, the members of the dominant class exercised coercion directly, physically. To the very extent that they constituted a small and highly conscious minority, defending precise and avowed privileges, the system functioned in a simple, transparent manner, without problems. This is not the case with the bourgeois class. This class, for the first time, sets up an independent apparatus which alone fully deserves the name of state, served by a permanent staff and acting in the name of abstract universalism and bourgeois egalitarianism. Centralized, based on the social division of labor and the career, it is endowed with a bureaucratic autonomy in the sense that the office becomes its own end. Detaching itself from the social body, it constantly tends to strengthen its internal cohesion and to perpetuate itself, if possible, by dominating the whole society. Making efficiency its ultimate goal, it creates its own hierarchy in formal contradiction with that which structures existing social relations of production. The bourgeoisie did not invent an instrument of this kind at one go. Beginning in Europe, with the constitutional monarchy, it was developed and improved in the course of time, through innumerable processes of trial and error. To assure domination by means of such a machine is considerably more complicated and delicate than the direct use of power by the dominant classes which prevailed in previous modes of production. As a human creation, the independent state could not be a perfect machine right away, and indeed it has not worked without a certain amount of stumbling. But on the whole it has worked, and it must be recognized that this has been no mean achievement. Even philosophers have been impressed by it, and indeed seen it as the supreme incarnation of the idea. 25. The independent state. What is the mechanism whereby a state which apparently stands above class antagonisms also acts as a reliable servant of the capitalist class? This is a question that has often worried Marxist theoreticians, and it does not seem that any generally accepted global answer has so far been given to it. Although we cannot go deeply into this problem here, two things seem clear. In the first place, we must eliminate from the analysis all simplistic explanations in terms of corruption, favoritism, the family background of civil servants, or the mysterious, covert influence of obscure financial forces. 26. Since it can only bring into play particular groups of interests, this mechanism, to the extent that it indeed exists, has a negative effect. It distorts the rules of the game, and lowers the quality of the service which the state is supposed to supply to the dominant class, within the framework of its proclaimed universality and eternal nature. Our problem is not to investigate to what extent the independent state is indeed independent, but rather how the specific interests of this apparatus come to coincide with those of the class which rules the national economy, in all circumstances and whatever the degree of real independence of the former. Secondly, in order to discover the specific elements of a political superstructure, we must inevitably study it through the cipher of economic relations. Now, an essential difference between the feudal system and capitalist production relations which is too often overlooked, if not deliberately ignored, is that the feudal lords, even when they used to live on their lands, did not actively interfere in the process of production. They were content to levy a tribute on the product under various forms. The power of economic decision generally belonged to the direct producers. It follows that the exploitation relation could not be reproduced by itself, in the normal process of the economic act. It had, each time, to be reconstituted by force. Seigneurial tithing was not an integral part of the reproduction process. It was an external, autonomous act, imposed with renewed arbitrariness. The coercion here was active and direct by nature, and could not emanate from any impersonal bureaucracy or abstract power. 27. By contrast, capitalist production relations, once established by an initial act of violence, are reproduced automatically and without violence, simply by their own unfolding. It is yesterday's insufficient wage that produces today's proletarian and yesterday's profit that produces today's capitalist. It is a part of what labor power produced yesterday that serves to buy the labor power of today. It suffices to let it go on. The coercive apparatus has a passive function only, to keep disturbers out of the way. On the other hand, by contrast with feudal lords or the conquerors, bandits, and chieftains of the Asiatic mode of production, the ruling class under capitalism has the exclusive right of decision on the social division of labor and apportionment of social resources. This is very important, because it means that such power cannot be the object of social bargaining, as could the surplus product extorted by earlier exploiters. The power of capital has detonated a specific dynamics. One can halt this only if one replaces it by another dynamics, that of the central plan. One cannot restrict or dilute it. Reducing tithes or tenants' dues could only have a favorable effect on the global yield of the individual plot peasant economy, to the benefit of all except a few parasites. But to reduce the part of surplus value accruing to capital would impair the functioning of a market economy, to the disadvantage of the whole society including the exploited class. A revolutionary party, by putting forward impossible demands, may accept and even wish for such a short-run deterioration, in order to weaken the system and accelerate its ruin. 18. But a state bureaucracy can by no means adopt this politique du pire. Such behavior would amount not to a revolutionary act but to a sign of inefficiency, and as such would be quite unacceptable to an organism whose foundations, structures, internal selection, and hierarchy are governed by the principle of efficiency. To wonder at the fact that an independent police ruthlessly suppresses political demonstrations, independent courts energetically protect property, etc., means to find it surprising that civil servants like all other citizens perform their jobs properly. Independence of the state means nothing other than entrusting it to people who make it their job, i.e. who transubstantiate political into technical problems. Within the framework of this rationality, there are not 1,000 solutions. Either the capitalists must be deprived of the power of decision in matters of investment, which is nothing less than making the revolution, or investment conditions must be rendered consistent with the motives of those who are supposed to carry them out, i.e. with profit-seeking. Since the revolution lies outside the vision of every single civil servant and even of the whole state apparatus, only the second course is left. The answer to our question is simple. In conditions of market economy, an independent state apparatus cannot help becoming an instrument of capitalist domination, because this apparatus, not having the aptitude to overthrow the system from above, is interested in getting the best out of it. To accomplish this, it has to run the system according to its rules. Why the existing state cannot be run for proletarian ends? This is the crux of the problem. For during the transition and especially during the period stretching from the moment the proletariat takes over power to the moment expropriation of the capitalists crosses the critical threshold at which the dynamic of reproduction is reversed, the revolutionary government has precisely, for a more or less long period, to make the system work in contradiction to its rules. This cannot occur without a temporary but significant fall in the yield of the economic machine, hence without immiserizing effects on all classes. What is important for our discussion is that these effects appear as inefficiency at the level of the management of society, and thereby stiffen political opposition to such a degree that the equilibrium can no longer be ensured by the indirect means provided by a representative and independent state. This is the fundamental reason why the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made machinery, and wield it for its own purposes. In order to get through this difficult period, the working class must organize itself for the direct exercise of political power. It is this direct exercise that constitutes the essence of what we call the dictatorship of the proletariat, beyond the mere form of words. In a certain sense, we here return to the type of political power that existed before the capitalist mode of production, in which the members of the dominant class performed coercion personally and directly. 29. Indirect exercise of power through the intermediary of a neutral state will thus have constituted the exclusive achievement of the bourgeois class, and as such a parenthetical phenomenon in human history. All past attempts to make use of the existing democratic parliamentary framework in order to get through this transitional period have failed, probably the most typical case of such a failure being the Chilean experience. If we took the trouble to go to the root of the matter, we would find that the ultimate cause of these failures was breakdown of the economic machine. The problem, of course, is not some supposed inefficiency of nationalized enterprises. A nationalized enterprise within the framework of a market economy is as efficient as any other, neither more nor less. At the same time, when all enterprises are nationalized and the opposite dynamic, that of the central plan, begins to operate, the economy as a whole will recover its full efficiency, and even attain a level considerably higher than it ever achieved before the transitional period. No, the problem is those enterprises which have not yet been nationalized, but which are expected to be, i.e. those which are nationalizable. In other words, assuming that the transition will be brought to its final issue, the problem at any given point of time is constituted by all enterprises except those which have already been nationalized. The problem is the bulk of capitalists, whose expropriation is only deferred, and whom we are compelled to permit temporarily to keep the power of life or death which they exercise over the economy, in their capacity as investment decision-makers. To expect that they will continue meekly to perform their accustomed role in the accumulation of capital, pending such time as they are dispossessed of the latter, would be the height of naivete. Not only will the threatened capitalists stop any new investment, they will disinvest. They will transform their fixed capital into money capital or commodity capital, and take it out of the country, at all costs, to the detriment of the means of production and its utilization. They will thus salvage as much as can be salvaged, while dilapidating the rest. And the ritual suggestion that this could be prevented by tighter exchange controls is simply not serious. The net result is an economic decline, which however temporary incites the discontent of the masses. Only those so committed to the revolutionary venture that they have come to consider it their personal asset will hold out. These are never more than a minority, since it goes without saying that one must have sacrificed to the revolution something more than a vote in elections, in order to feel committed for better or worse. The followers, i.e. the overwhelming majority, will tend to give in. This is what determines the need for the leading section of the working class to organize itself directly into a coercive apparatus. Thus a direct repressive apparatus is necessary, not so much to deal with the behavior of the exploiters themselves, during the process of their elimination. If that were the case, the problem would not be difficult to solve, but principally to deal with opposition and adverse movements induced indirectly within the exploited masses themselves, as a result of the general deterioration of the situation provoked by the behavior of the exploiters. Furthermore, it is not the case that the transition as such will ever be over, and the higher stage of communism begin, as soon as the last of the old exploiters is eliminated and the power of economic decision invested in the community. What is rather the case is that the critical period during which dictatorship of the proletariat is indispensable is then closed, and from then onwards a new period is initiated during which the problem is not how to repress but, on the contrary, how to get rid of the repressive apparatus. If the old exploiting class has indeed disappeared, and if direct exercise of power by the proletariat has prevented the creation of a new ruling caste of bureaucrats, the transition, however long it may take, henceforth involves neither break nor discontinuity. The proletarian state. What are the concrete forms, the constituent elements, of the apparatus of coercion specific to the proletarian state during the transition? Marx, Engels, and especially Lenin tackled this problem in detail, starting from the historical experience of the Commune. We can summarize their conclusions under two main headings: suppression of officialdom, and concentration of both legislative and executive power within the same instances. And it is the first of these goals that is most important. The principal means proposed for attaining it were the following: 1. Election and revocability at all levels, including within the army; 2. Periodicity of public offices, so that everybody becomes a bureaucrat for a while, and therefore nobody can become a bureaucrat; 3. Salaries that do not exceed a skilled worker's wage. 30. It is immediately evident, on the one hand, that if these measures are indeed implemented the bureaucratic career is indeed suppressed, and, on the other hand, that they have never and nowhere been implemented. So far as the Soviet Union is concerned, they were explicitly rejected as early as Lenin's time, and even by Lenin himself. The ultimate argument they came up against, and which eventually determined their rejection, was efficiency. We may leave aside those recurrent polemics between Lenin and the workers' opposition on the question of the civil administration, wherein Lenin, in diametrical opposition to all his previous analyses, argued that collective work be left without leaders, without a chief invested with a precise responsibility, without a strict order created uniquely by the leaders will. 31. That collegiate management must be accompanied by the precisest definition of the personal responsibility of every individual for a precisely defined job. 32. And that to contend that every worker knows how to run the state is demagogic nonsense. 33. And so on. Under the constraints of a recalcitrant reality, the author of The State and Revolution, knowing very well what he was speaking about, did not hesitate to assimilate technical administration and political rule, and calmly turned down workers yearning for the latter on the grounds that they were unfit for the former. All he had said previously about the direct exercise of power by the working class as such, i.e. all that constituted the novelty of the workers' state, was now readily forgotten. When he was reminded of it, Lenin answered in terms of the social origin of high-ranking civil servants, that is to say, in terms absolutely irrelevant to the point at issue. For example, it is absolutely untrue to say that we have no confidence in the working class and that we are keeping the workers out of the governing bodies. We are on the lookout for every worker who is at all fit for managerial work. We are glad to have him and give him a trial. 34. Lenin was simply ignoring the fact that the essential thing was not that the administrators should be of working class origin, but that workers qua workers should participate in administrative work. A passage from The State and Revolution is quite characteristic here. Koski displays a superstitious reverence for ministries, but why can they not be replaced, say, by committees of specialists working under sovereign, all-powerful Soviets of workers and soldiers' deputies? Well, it seems that this superstitious reverence did not disappear after the revolution, since the People's Commissariats were precisely not committees of specialists but true ministries, just with a different nomenclature. Instead of commissars playing the role of technical counselors to the all-powerful Soviets, with the latter being both legislative and executive bodies, it was the Soviets which in a sense played the role of political counselors to the executive commissars. We may leave aside all these aspects of the question, since it is in the military domain that the argument has been definitely settled. This is the domain, par excellence, in which efficiency is not a question of competence but of structure. Before seizing power, in 1917, Lenin wrote, St. Petersburg has a population of about 2 million. Take half. Let us even subtract an entire fourth as physically unfit. There remain 750,000 who, serving in the militia, say, one day in 15, would form an army of 50,000. That's the type of state we need. That's the kind of militia that would be a people's militia in deed and not only in words. 35 That a militia of this description would be a people's militia, nobody doubts. But that it would have anything in common however loosely with an army was a dream from which post-revolutionary reality held in store a cruel awakening, when we tried to create a Red Army without them. Our 10 or 12 million soldiers did not make up a single division. 36 This statement was not a casual figure of speech. It must be correlated with the repeated references that Lenin made to the ridiculously small forces that foreign intervention and the White Guards had at their disposal, by contrast with the tremendous difficulties that the Bolsheviks had in beating them off. The Entente's intervention in the south was carried out with only 10,000 men. The White offensive against Petrograd was launched with even less significant forces. Had the Baltic states decided to join it, with even their miniature armies, there is not the slightest doubt, admitted Lenin, that we would have been defeated. 37 With an army of only 1 million, he states elsewhere, Japan could have conquered Russia, and so on. The question is not, we repeat, one of technical aptitude. The question is rather one of hierarchy and discipline. Unpalatable as it may be for revolutionary romanticists, it is precisely the robotization of men, their conditioning by the arrogance and impudence of the officers in the words used by Lenin himself, that alone makes it possible to defeat a division. It is just for this reason that millions of armed people do not make a division, even if they include sufficient numbers of technicians of every kind. If the Tsarist officers were eventually called back into the Red Army, this was certainly not for their science but for their methods, in order to have them apply, says Lenin, a discipline that surpassed the old Tsarist army in brutality, strict, stern measures, including capital punishment, measures that even the former government did not apply. 38 It was necessary, said Lenin on another occasion, to compel this army to use the most cruel and repugnant part of what we had inherited from the capitalists. 39 There is, moreover, nothing new about this. It suffices to get rid of a certain superstitious reverence and look reality in the face, and remember that the Commune itself, that holy symbol of proletarian heroism, was vanquished by significantly smaller forces. Yet the Versailles troops were not exactly the finest specimen of a regular army, the motley lot of an army, the dregs of the Bonapartist soldatesca, released from prison by the grace of Bismarck, with the gendarmes of Valentin and the sergeants de ville of Pietri for their nucleus, set off by the pontifical zouaves, the Chouans of Charette and the Vendines of Cathalino, the whole placed under the runaway Decembrist generals of capitulation. That is the picture of it given by Marx. 40 It was. However, this army, estimated to have consisted of about 40,000 men, of whom only some 10,000 took an active part in the field during the final attack on Paris, which defeated the National Guard with its 300,000 men, about half of which was constituted by the workers' battalions. Mao Zedong, although hardly to be suspected of being an unconditional believer in efficiency, nevertheless wrote, "The existence of a regular Red Army of adequate strength is a necessary condition for the existence of Red political power. If we have local Red Guards only, but no regular Red Army, then we cannot cope with the regular White forces, but only with the landlords' levies." 41 Referring to similar views expressed by Trotsky American Samoa early as March 1918, Bettelheim writes bitterly that this conception is linked to the idea that there does not exist a properly proletarian way of fighting and making war. 42 No, indeed, no such thing does exist save for what Lenin called the guerrilla force of evil memory. 43 Why should it exist? Yet martial virtues remain an essential attribute for the proletarian cause, under certain historic circumstances. And here is the crux of the matter. Within a specific, unfavorable national and international relation of forces, the proletarian revolution has to face the dilemma, inefficiency or bureaucracy. In order to survive in spite of the threats that assail it from all sides, the revolution opts for bureaucracy. Then it eventually gets the division it wants, even several of them, an entire Red Army, and defends itself efficiently against the attacks of its external enemies. But it perishes all the same from within. This sort of degeneration is the only means that history possesses, in such a case, to crush to death an untimely adventure. The withering away of the state. In the light of what has been said, it appears that the question of whether and how the state could wither away following the abolition of classes, albeit distinct, is subordinate to the preceding one. The answer to it depends on what kind of state we are dealing with. It seems evident to me that, if I were summoned to spend 24 hours every fortnight with the militia, I would not be discontented at all if, as those whom the militia was pursuing, whether bank robbers or political dissidents, grew rarer and rarer, these calls. 129. Became less and less frequent, and finally stopped. 44. But the same would not be true if I were a professional soldier or policeman. Between the two situations, there is as much difference as between forced labor and a career. The ideological position of the person involved does not make any difference. Thus a state consisting of the proletariat exercising political power directly would evolve in direct relation to the tasks that had to be carried out by this proletariat. As these tasks were progressively fulfilled, more and more of the functions of the state would become obsolete and the state would wither away. When all its goals were attained, in other words, when all classes including the proletariat as such had disappeared, there would exist neither object nor subject for such a state, which would dissolve of its own accord and fade away. By contrast, the bureaucratic independent state, by definition, has neither goal nor subject outside itself. It is itself both its own object and its own subject. To expect it to dismantle itself just because, following the suppression of classes, its existence can no longer serve the interests of one or more classes in struggle against others, is an idealistic view of history. To the extent that it is truly bureaucratic, the state apparatus cares very little about classes and their problems, however indispensable the machine itself may objectively be for the exploitation of one class by another. Is it in any case possible to have a state in a classless society? This question is really only verbal, since everything depends on how class is defined. If the bureaucracy itself is considered as a class, the question obviously does not arise. But can then the state exist in a society where there is no class other than the state bureaucracy itself? In this case, the answer ought to be affirmative, for not only can such a state exist, it already does exist historically. Leaving aside the disputed cases of the Soviet Union and other countries where communist parties are in power, we have today the example of Africa south of the Sahara. As a consequence of a decolonization carried out without mass struggle, which removed the white settlers or neutralized them politically, a state machine fabricated out of nothing has been taken over and run by an elite. This elite, whatever its definition, class, stratum, bureaucratic bourgeoisie, coterie, constitutes a highly privileged social group, standing against an undifferentiated mass of poor peasants and urban proletarians. This group is endowed with a self-consciousness and cohesion that is all the more highly developed in that its goal is nothing but its own perpetuation. 45. Naturally, all this does not mean that the bureaucratic state is eternal. The fact that it does not dissolve of its own accord does not mean that it is indestructible. But, like any other institution, it must be attacked and pulled down from outside. The secret of a cultural revolution of this sort, which would attack the state from outside without itself becoming institutionalized and hence bureaucratized, remains to be discovered. Indeed, it is the general theory itself of the state that remains to be established. In one of the plans for his Critique of Political Economy, addressed to La Salle on February 22, 1858, Marx listed theory of the state as subject of the fourth projected volume, which was to come after wage labor and before international trade. Unfortunately, this book was never written. But this would only have been half as harmful, if Marxist tradition had not since then been built on the assumption that the problem had in fact been solved.